Namaste. We are continuing with our series on Bhagavad Gita. So far we have seen Krishna teaching Arjuna in the second chapter and covering both the topics of self knowledge and right action, also called Brahma Vidya and Yoga Shastra. So, while expounding upon self knowledge, Krishna beautifully described in negation the true nature of the self by saying that the unreal has no true existence and the real never goes out of existence. Therefore, by seeing the impermanent as false and thus abiding as the pure awareness, one can realize one's true nature, and thereby there is nothing to grieve either for the body or the mind, which are impermanent, as one's true nature of pure awareness is eternal. Then he also described the way of right action or karma yoga by describing that the way of pure action is one of total attention, what he called Atmika Buddhi, where there is total attention that's free of any duality of desire and fear and any interest in affluence and enjoyment, but simply a total attention to the doing itself. And he described it very clearly in a very famous verse as three aspects. One is that one doesn't have any right for the fruits of the action, but only for action itself. And one ought not to imagine oneself to be the agent of the act and thereby being free of doership. And also, one ought to have no inclination for inaction. So, by taking this attitude of acting, one is free of any sense of false notion of doership and therefore desire and fear associated with action. And thus, one is free from the bondage of action. And this results in equanimity, which is why Krishna described yoga as equanimity itself. Yoga uchyat. Yoga or karma yoga, which is used synonymously, is an expression of skill in action. Karmasu kaushalam. So when there is clarity of the fact, the truth that all actions are agents, and thereby there is natural compassion that's born out of clarity that there is no individual doer, but all actions are happening in an ordered way. And in this compassion, there is skill, because there is true skill in that there is no self aggrandizement in action, but only an expression of compassion, which is the realization of the unique potential of each being. So, this is how Krishna describes karma yoga. Now, moving forward, we come to the concluding of the second chapter, where Arjuna asks a beautiful question. He asks, now, having listened to Krishna teach on what is self knowledge and what is right action, Arjuna deduces that one who is rooted in self knowledge and ever engaged in right action must be one of steadfast wisdom. So, Arjuna, being a true listener, truly listening to the essence of what Krishna is pointing to, asks a beautiful question by saying, what is the description of such a person who is of steady wisdom? He coins a beautiful expression called sthita prajna. He says, sthita prajnasya ka bhasha. What is the description of this being with steady wisdom who is ever absorbed in his own being, in pure awareness, who is not caught in the ever changing aspect of body and mind and thoughts and feelings, but ever rooted in pure awareness? Such a being is one of steady wisdom. And so Arjuna asks, how to describe such a being? How does this person sit, speak, move about? It's a very interesting question. Why is Arjuna interested in how does this person live? How does this person talk and move and so on? Here I'm reminded of a small story from Ramana Maharishi's life, where very wonderful devotees, disciples, people drawn to Sri Ramana, and one of them was Arthur Osborne. He was a very accomplished scholar from Oxford who was drawn to Sri Ramana's teachings, who went to India, spent time with him. And he was once asked, um, why do you spend so much time just simply sitting in the presence of Sri Ramana Maharshi? And he supposedly answered that as long as the teacher is alive, the teacher is the teaching. It's a beautiful insight, because teaching is not words, teaching is not intellectual understanding, teaching is living. And the best embodiment of such living is the teacher himself. And such teacher alone is truly capable of teaching, not one who understands the scripture simply or simply is a scholar. So the teacher is the teaching, and the teaching coming from such a teacher is the teacher. In other words, one doesn't have to go search for a quote unquote living guru, as some people talk about, because the very teaching coming from a teacher, whether alive or not, has a living quality to it because it's come from the right source. And that is why Bhagavad Gita is still a living teaching. Sri Ramana Maharishi's teachings are still a living teaching. And truly, all these teachings are pointing to our own inner awareness, which is where the true teacher lives. The teacher is not without. So Arjuna asks this question because he wants to understand the quality of a being who embodies this wisdom, and thereby you can understand the wisdom itself. So Krishna now responds beautifully with a very nice verse, which was in fact chosen by Sri Ramana Maharishi also as one of the few verses of Gita. The verse Krishna says, the quality of a man who embodies wisdom is that he is one who has renounced all desires entering the mind, and he is simply satisfied being himself. The verse in Sanskrit is Prajahati yada kaman sarvan partha manogatan atmanyevatmana tushta stita prajñas tadochyate. So it simply describes that such a being is rooted in equanimity, because any desire that enters is simply having no ground to stick to. It just, there is no place, no ground for the desire to take root. It's just like they say, burned seeds falling on dry ground. It cannot take any root. So such a being in whom desires cannot take any root, and who is simply satisfied by himself or herself, and ever abiding in his own or her own being, in which is truly beyond all duality of gender and so on, the pure being of awareness, the space of awareness. Such a being is Stita Prajna, or a man of steady wisdom. And Krishna goes on to describe that monk who is one of steady wisdom is unperturbed in sorrow, because he is free from any longing. There is no longing for enjoyment, as we already saw. There is complete freedom from enjoyment. Therefore, he moves about without any attachment, without any fear, or without any anger. As a nice poem, famous poem says, if you can meet with triumph and disaster, treat those two emotions just the same. That is to say, be in equanimity toward any happening, whether good or bad, and therefore there is no longing for delight, longing for pleasure, and therefore there is total freedom from fear and anger. Such a being is a sthita prajna, is what Krishna describes. In other words, he just summarizes the essence of self knowledge and right action together as it is embodied in the living of a man of steady wisdom or a woman of steady wisdom, a monk. And so Krishna goes on to say that the wisdom of such a person remains established, and there is no attachment for anything external. And the word attachment is important because it is not a state of inertness, it is not a state of being uncaring. In fact, there is tremendous compassion and love. There's no investment for a particular outcome or a desire for a particular eventuality, but everything is accepted with the same spirit, and therefore he or she neither welcomes nor rejects anything good or bad. Such a being is a man or a woman of steady wisdom, sthita prajna. There's another nice poem of William Blake where we can see such wisdom being expressed in different cultures too. Uh, this poem, he says, "He who binds to himself a joy does the winged life destroy." So he says, if one is bound to a particular joy, then the freedom of flying, winged life is a metaphor for one who can fly, one who can be free like a bird. It is destroyed. Whereas he adds, he who kisses the joy as it flies lives in eternity's sunrise. That is, whenever the joy comes, he just simply he this if we just let it come and go and just let it fly, let it not try to hold on to it. And similarly, therefore, if something bad happens, I may not be bothered by it. Then such a being lives in eternity's sunrise. So in other words, another way to say is the man of steady wisdom, sthita prajna, who embodies self-knowledge and right action, he doesn't hold on to memory. There is only the memory of what is necessary for the factual transaction, or what is called as chronological memory. But there is no psychological memory. There is no recording of the pleasure, of the pain, and wanting more pleasure and wanting less pain. There is no continuity. Each moment is fresh, and therefore there is a natural letting go of every moment as it passes. And this is only possible when one is deeply abiding in the clarity and the insight of the impermanence of all that comes. Everything that comes passes. To abide in this clarity of impermanence is vairagya. And this vairagya is a natural, it naturally produces this living each moment fully without continuity. And therefore, dying to each moment as it is over. Only the chronological memory of how to use a computer or how to speak a language, these things, of course, continue. But there is no psychological memory of holding on to an image, holding on to an identity, holding on to a pleasure, a pain, a praise. None of so that is what Krishna describes here as sthita prajna, one who lives each moment and dying to that moment as it is over. It's not a conscious effort involved here. It is not that there is an entity who's living and dying, because any such effort is rooted in the false sense of doership. So this insight, this seeing of the impermanence of all and abiding in that insight profoundly naturally results in this letting go of each moment, and therefore living with no continuity from a psychological perspective. That's what Krishna describes as sthita prajna. And such a being naturally, Krishna adds, withdraws the senses from the objects just as a tortoise withdraws its limbs. So he's not drawn to the sense objects all the time, but The senses are naturally withdrawn and inwardly abiding, as a tortoise can withdraw its limbs and remains inwardly, and only engages in action as necessary, not engaging in sense objects for gratification or for pleasure, but simply engaging as natural, spontaneous response to stimuli, and therefore not indulging in any desire, and at the same time not suppressing either, because fulfilling desires and suppressing desires are the same movement. It is both rooted in the ego, which says I want to enjoy desires or I want to control these desires. So Krishna says, that's why very clearly in the following verse, that a man who tries to be abstinent, who tries to control desires, the objects may recede from him, but the taste for them lives on. So he's basically living like a hypocrite. Whereas Krishna adds that one who is abiding in his own being, for him there is no taste even. So he doesn't have to make any effort to control or suppress desires, and naturally, neither does he indulge in desires. There is no taste left because there is no desire for or longing for delights and pleasures. He just simply responds to stimuli. When there is hunger, food is eaten. When there is work, it is done. And when there is any such scenario, whatever the stimulus is, the response is spontaneous, natural, and the most intelligent. This is what we see in the lives of great realized beings as well. There is no, that's why Krishna pointed out even in Karma Yoga that there is no. On the other hand, there is total action with total attention. That is the quality of a sthita. That's why Krishna says, neither does he indulge nor does he suppress, but he simply abides in his own being and responds intelligently to whatever the moment requires. And then he also adds, on the other hand, why it is important to not indulge in the sense organs or in the sense pleasures, because the sense pleasures can take away. There is a very easy way to rationalize by saying that, okay, I cannot, I'm not supposed to control the desire, so let me just indulge in them. But such indulging in desires only takes one away, because the sense organs and the mind is so powerful that are taken away or deluded by indulging in sense pleasures. That is why Krishna says that keeping senses alive without running away with them, one ought to meditate upon the supreme being one's own nature as pure awareness. And only when one abides in the pure being without running away along the way the senses are pulling can one remain steadfast. Because Krishna adds that if a person, on the other hand, dwells on the sense objects, there is, in fact, Krishna, while he first pointed out the danger of suppressing sense pleasures, because if you suppress sense pleasures and then the taste of them still remains, therefore it is important to not suppress them, but abide in the pure wisdom of being. As Ramakrishna once said, it is what is necessary is to cultivate love in the way he expresses it, which is that love for God is will naturally remove the taste for all lower pleasures. So it's another way of saying that abiding as pure awareness, or having this sense of total surrender to God, who is the only mover, the only intelligent agent of all actions. So the manifest being Ishvara is the only intelligent mover of all actions, the unmanifest being pure awareness. This is the only reality. And to abide in this is the most essential thing, and not suppressing sense desires. That is the first aspect. But then Krishna also now emphasizes in great detail why, just as suppressing is not the right way, indulging is definitely not the right way, because indulging in sense pleasure causes attachment, and from attachment, he says, grows desire, and from desire comes anger, and from anger comes delusion, and delusion one loses his own memory and understanding, and when understanding goes, he completely is lost. It's almost similar, or in a certain way, one of the influencer for those familiar with where Yoda says that fear is the way of the dark side because fear leads to anger, anger leads to hate, hate leads to suffering. And I recently came across that George Lucas was in fact inspired by Vedanta partly when he came up with the whole idea of Jedi's, which is not surprising at all because this is exactly coming from Bhagavad Gita, where Krishna says beautifully the sequence of how desire leads to complete destruction. If one is caught in desire and attachment, it leads to anger because naturally, when you don't get what you want, there is anger and there is resentment. And this anger results in delusion, and delusion causes understanding to be lost because we act in a moment of delusion and anger without any discrimination. And when such action happens through loss of understanding, then there is complete destruction. So, this is why Krishna says to be free from attraction and free from attachment to desires and free from indulging in sense pleasures is vital. And this is how a self realized being abides by neither suppressing his desires nor indulging in them, but simply remaining serene. And this serenity eradicates all sorrows. That's why someone nicely said, when you get up in the morning, if one gets up thinking that, wow, I'm going to do something today and very excited, he's not serene. When one gets up in the morning and says, oh, should I get up? And he's not wanting to get out of bed, he's not serene either. But one who gets up without being excited and without being depressed about anything, but just simply wakes up like a bird wakes up in the morning and goes about, such a being is serene. And that's what Krishna calls the Sthita Prajna, a being of steady wisdom. And therefore, Krishna summarizes by saying, wisdom can only be there when one is steady, and being steady and being abiding in this wisdom alone can result in peace. And without this steadiness of wisdom, which is to abide in one's own being, which is to embody one's true nature, and therefore morally act in the most intelligent way, which is the path of way of a karma yogi, is alone the only true abiding peace. Otherwise, anything just simply comes and goes, and there is never any kind of true peace felt while living. And when there is no peace, what results is confusion, and such confusion only creates more confusion, which is why we see so many conflicts and wars and divisions in society, because all actions are rooted in confusion and not in peace. When action emanates from peace, then it's a totally different flavor to it. So that's why Krishna says, for the mind follows in the wake of wandering senses, the mind is carried away like a boat is carried away by waters. So if there is no control over where the senses are going, not at the same time there is, um, in other words, as we said, there is, if one is completely indulged where the senses are going, then he is taken away in any direction, like a boat is taken away in the waters. And we have already seen, on the other hand, suppressing it through force is also not the way. So the way given by Krishna, and the teaching here, is to simply be aware, alert, and thereby not be drawn to the way of attachment to sense pleasures, and naturally abide in the highest and the purest sense of one's own nature. And and therefore, Krishna says that this wisdom is established very naturally when one is withdrawn from all external im- uh, impermanent perishable objects and ideas and concepts, and one abides in his own being. And there is a nice verse towards the end of the chapter where Krishna adds that For such a being, what appears as night is like day to them, and for others, what is night is like day to him. So, let me say the Sanskrit verse. It's a beautiful verse. It says, "Yanisha sarva bhutanam tasyam jagrati sanyami, yasyam jagrati bhutani sanisha pashyatto mune." That is, the self-realized man keeps awake during that which is night for all, and that during which all keep awake is night to the sage. It's a very beautiful verse, very metaphorical. It's essentially what Krishna points to is what appears as night to to all the creatures of the world is full of light to him, and the other way around, what appears as day to them is has no interest for the self-realized being. So this may seem cryptic, but one easy way to understand it is the famous illusion of the famous metaphor of snake and a rope. So one can be walking in a dark alley and come to a rope and think it's a snake, and to one who sees the snake, there is no rope there because what he sees is a snake. But when the light is on, which symbolizes wisdom, he sees that there is no snake there. There is only a rope, and he sees only rope. He doesn't see a snake. So what is snake to the unwise is rope to the wise, and what is rope to the wise is snake to the unwise. Uh, Another way to say it is there is a beautiful Buddhist expression where it says form is emptiness and emptiness is form, which means the exact same thing. That normally all embodied beings are drawn to form, and to them form is day. Form is what is awake. Form is what is alive. But but a realized being sees all forms as empty because all forms are impermanent and they have no reality to them. As we already saw, the unreal has no true existence. So anything that has form has come into form and it will go out of form. So it has no abiding reality to it. So all form is emptiness. And emptiness is form because what is empty, which is the unmanifested pure awareness, is the only thing that abides, is the only thing that has form, in the sense that it is the only thing that is perceived by a true realized being. So the unrealized perceives forms, where the realized being perceives emptiness, and the realized being perceives emptiness as the only true form. So this is why Krishna says what the realized being sees as night is seen as day by the unrealized, and what the unrealized sees as day is seen as night by realized. So it's all pointing to the same thing, the duality between the the false distinction between the manifest and the unmanifest. It's another example is how there is gold and there is ornament. The one who sees the ornament doesn't see the gold, and the one who sees the gold sees the ornament but sees the ornament as simply an impermanent appearance in gold. The only reality to the ornament is the gold. So these are all ways by which to understand this verse, which simply beautifully points out that the vision of a realized being is completely different from the vision of the unrealized, and therefore there is a day and night difference literally between the two. And finally, Krishna summarizes by saying that the man attains peace into whom all desires enter in the same way the water of the sea remains unchanged when all the rivers enter. So it's just another metaphor where there's so many rivers and streams entering an ocean and the ocean remains still. Similarly, a man of pure awareness, man abiding in pure awareness, whatever events come into his um, life, it has no impact on him. They come and they go, just as streams enter the river, enter the ocean, but the ocean remains unmoving. Similarly, the man of steady wisdom remains unmoving, and he is free of the sense of me and mine. And nirmamo nirahankara sa shantim adhigachati. Krishna says he is free of me, he is free of mine, and therefore he is ever abiding in pure peace. Shantim adhigachati. Such a beautiful verse again, where Krishna says the freedom is just the same. Very, that's why Ramana Maharshi used to say this knowledge is so simple because it is so direct. It's not let's say like learning a computer language or learning an instrument where there is so many complex things to learn and there is so many steps and all that. Here there are no steps, there is no complication. It is so direct because it is our own truth, and therefore there is only different ways of expressing the one simple truth, and yet it is repeated in so many ways because we are so deeply conditioned to the false. And that's why Krishna says here that freedom of eye and freedom of mind is the only true peace. So we saw the whole thing in this expression of how a realized being with steady wisdom lives as the embodiment of one living free of eye and mind. And such a person, such a being, is established in Brahman. And so Krishna calls it Yesha Brahmani Sthiti Prapti. He says this is the state of truth, state of Brahman. And such a state, Krishna very clearly identifies as being possible here and now. There is a lot of people, many religious thinking, which postpones freedom to after death, to heaven, to paradise, and various names associated with it. But Krishna here very emphatically states that this state of truth is available here and now, and that is the only meaningful religious pursuit. Everything else is just divisive and only causes more conflict and more division in society in the name of religion. So Krishna emphasizes that this state of being, this state of Brahman is available here and now, and one abides in this state and one leaves the body in the same state. And that is the beauty of this realization or this wisdom. So this is how the second chapter ends. And of course, Krishna, the chapter ends rather, as every chapter ends, as we've already seen, in a beautiful way. There is a verse that says this is the second chapter, which is called Sankhya Yoga, because it actually Sankhya literally some people associate it with counting, which is true, but the deeper meaning of Sankhya is that which is expounded correctly. Samyak khyati iti Sankhya, they say. So that which has been expounded perfectly is Sankhya. So the perfect wisdom of self knowledge is the topic of this chapter, and therefore it's called Sankhya Yoga. And this is again Brahma Shastra and Yoga Vidya, and that's how Krishna's chapter ends. Iti, this dialogue between Krishna and Arjuna in Bhagavad Gita, which is like an Upanishad on the topic of self knowledge, Sankhya Yoga, ends thus, is how this chapter ends. So, to quickly summarize what we saw today, Krishna answers Arjuna's question about what is the way in which an embodied being, in which a being embodying this wisdom of self knowledge and right action, karma yoga, describing that such a being lives in constant equanimity, unperturbed by any movement of sorrow or pleasure, and not longing for any eventuality, any outcome, and simply goes about living each moment, dying to the moment as it is over, with no psychological continuity moment to moment, neither indulging in any sense pleasures nor suppressing any sense pleasures, and thereby living ever in serenity, and thereby living in this wisdom which makes it clear to his vision that all forms are empty, and therefore all that appears as interesting better for all worldly creatures appears as pointless to him, and that which is not seen by the worldly beings is the only abiding reality of this steady wisdom, the one of steady wisdom, and he abides in the steady wisdom, in this ever abiding vision of God, which is one's own self as pure awareness. And this state of freedom, this state of being, is ever available to all of us here and now. This is the essence of this teaching of this chapter, which summarizes the entire wisdom of Bhagavad Gita, or for that matter, all the Upanishads. So, with this, we'll conclude today.